topic for today is the Enlightenment and the beginning of contemporary cultural conflict. So we will work through a number of historical issues, and we will get some thematic issues that I think help us set the stage for where we're going to finish up Western Civ 202. The Enlightenment era events. Scientific Revolution, 1543 to 1687, and those are broad numbers and dates. They're not absolutely specific, but that's the era that I want us to look at, the dates I want us to look at. And by the way, you know this, I don't ask too many dates on final exams. I just want you to get 8 ranges, because you need to understand that the Enlightenment followed the Reformation and Renaissance. You need to understand the Renaissance followed the Middle Ages. And some of those eras overlap, but the benefit of understanding eras is to see how thoughts developed, how ideas developed within Western culture. Nicholas Copernicus published Concerning the Revolutions in the Celestial Bodies in 1543, generating debate concerning the heliocentric theory of the universe. Up until this point, people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. We kind of automatically know now, based on our science education as first graders, that the sun is the center of the universe. That wasn't always assumed. And so the first people that came along to say that were attacked, and in some ways were attacked by the church itself, because there was an assumption from Catholic theology within the Middle Ages that the Earth was the center of the universe. And so that was a real a challenging pushback from Copernicus and others like Galileo. He created the first functional telescope, and he confirmed the Copernican theory. And Galileo was told that he needed to recant his beliefs, and he did actually for a period of time. And then he took them back because Galileo was a Christian, yet he was a student of the universe. He explored the universe as best he could through telescopes and other things. And mathematics, that's why stuff like mathematics and science is important. If you want to discover things, you've got to use math to do it. My son is kind of fascinated with the solar system and space, so every time we go to the library, he gets a new space book. And one of the space books that he's looking at, we read through, it talks about how they can tell the distance between certain planets using a parallax method. And I read that kind of stuff, and it is out of my league. I mean, I'm not even close to being able to understand how all that works. But it's amazing to me that scientists can tell you how far a planet is from the sun and how far a planet is from the Earth by using math. I mean, they don't have a tape measure. You guys get that, right? You know how I measure things? I get a tape measure. That's the only way. I can't measure things other ways, but they can. It's fascinating how they're able to do that. Anyway, that was an aside that was completely unnecessary. So there's Galileo. Then you get Isaac Newton. He published Principia in 1687. He noted the reality of universal gravitation. He also is the one that can be credited for developing the scientific method, steps, and hypotheses for determining facts. So, in your science textbook, does anybody remember the scientific method that you talked about in science textbooks?
Yeah.
Somebody remember that? I don't remember all the processes, but you make an educated guess, and then you do observation, and then you go from observation to hypothesis, and then you retest, and so on and so forth. That came from Newton. Isaac Newton gave us the scientific method as we study it and as we work through it. So we'll skip that note because you haven't read that. I would like to read that this week. And the point there is simply this, though, that Pavlak doesn't note that these gentlemen were believers, followers of Jesus, and their study of the universe was because they were Christians. And of course, many, as you will see, took their thoughts and ideas and went a completely different direction. Okay, the Enlightenment era events, absolutism, and politics. What we're going to do is look at some historical examples in the Enlightenment era. Some of these are interesting, some not so much, but we're going to work through them anyway, because it's an academic setting, correct? And sometimes we have to do things that we don't necessarily like to do. How many of you have those classes, by the way? I'm not asking you to tell me which classes. Classes that are just tough for you. Tough to work through. Well, for the next 30 minutes, some of this is going to be tough to work through, but we'll push through. Because we're all adults, right? Well, some of us are adults. The idea of absolute monarchy. I'm trying to make this fun for y'all. Okay? The divine right of kings, and this is an important concept in the Enlightenment era, so you might want to make note of this. The divine right of kings. There was a belief in this era of world history or Western history that kings were divinely appointed to their thrones, and succession from them followed from their connection to God's will. In other words, it was God's design that Henry VIII was King of England, and therefore God's design that his children would reign after him. And that wasn't just true of Henry VIII. That was a concept that permeated the Western world at the time, Europe. So France, the monarchs in France thought that way, the monarchs in Spain thought that way, so on and so forth. They believed God appointed them. Where do you think they would get that idea?
Church.
Yeah.
They were raised that way, just sort of like Pharaoh.
Okay, they were raised to think that. It's in the Bible.
Yeah.
That's all.
Paul said that God appointed
Yeah.
rulers and leaders. And if you think about that, that is a fascinating affirmation from Paul,
Yeah.
given who the leader of the world was at the time.
It was meant to outline his sovereignty and not his intentional appointing of certain people for because of their lineage or something like that, or because
What,
of who
Paul's
they are.
comment?
No, I think it was meant to outline his sovereignty as and that they were not because they were good kings, but because God
Yeah.
was accomplishing His purposes.
Yes, through them, whether they were good or evil.
Right.
Yeah. But the fascinating thing for me is to read that God is in charge regardless of who. I mean, it's not like the Roman emperors loved Christians. That didn't happen until Constantine, 300 years later. I mean, the Roman emperor following Paul's affirmation of that was Nero, a crazed madman who took Christians and impaled them, dipped them in oil, and used them to light the way, the walkways and the roadways in Rome. And Paul said, God appoints leaders. I only say that, I only bring that up to say that's where this idea came from. It's a biblical concept and idea. But of course, when the leader, the monarch, takes on that particular idea, it's room for pride, it's room for arrogance. But it's not. It wasn't just the king that thought that way. This isn't just a monarchical concept. It's not just like Henry VIII thought this way, and so he was going to hold on to his throne because he thought this way. No, the general culture thought this way for a long period of years. And so they gave the kings and they gave their leaders a great amount of authority as a result of it. But I say that by way of application, too, to remember, regardless of what's going on in our country, God's in charge, folks.
Amen.
I mean, I'm glad we live in a country where we still have our voice through the voting and election process. Thankful for that. And yet, regardless of who's elected in the houses of Congress and regardless of who's in the White House, that doesn't intimidate God. He's on his throne and he rules regardless of who's sitting in the White House. And that should encourage us. It should motivate us, but it should encourage us. And we don't need to be... I'll stop there because I'm going to go beyond the course, the course content. Enlightened despotism, it was the concept that benefited unity and simplicity in government. And that's what monarchs do. A good monarch meant that, if you reigned well as a monarch, you could cut out bureaucracy because everybody listened to you. You were the monarch. If you were a bad monarch, you messed things up because everything rises and falls on leadership. When you're a poor leader, it did better. I mean, poor leaders that have a lot of power mess up countries. And that's what happened in this era. Some countries, exploded in terms of economic development and growth and ideas, well, they were led by people who were wise and smart and put wise and smart people around them. Other countries that struggled economically and struggled in certain ways had poor leaders. We'll talk about a few of those examples just now. So you have Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu as an advisor at the early 1600s. They're the characters that Dumas wrote about in The Three Musketeers. They're the historical characters that Dumas picked up on, Alexander Dumas picked up on and wrote about in The Three Musketeers. Then you get Louis XIV, or the Sun King, as he was known, 1643 to 1715 were his dates of life. Louis XIV gave us some interesting things. He instituted a cabinet. So our concept of a presidential cabinet with different leaders and advisors in different areas came from Louis XIV, at least in some level. He built the Palace of Versailles, which is absolutely gorgeous. If you've seen pictures of it, if you haven't, you can Google those and just kind of see what he did there. He's also known for this particular phrase, une loi, une foi. One king, one law, one faith. And what do you think his faith was? Catholicism. So if you were a Protestant in France, what do you think that meant?
Persecution.
You were in trouble. You could be a Protestant in your house, but don't tell anybody about it. Don't go meet. And many Christians who did try to meet and practice their faith in an open way in France, who were not Catholics, were persecuted, and persecuted pretty harshly during the Enlightenment era and the era that followed. Louis XIV aimed for military glory. So there's one Enlightenment monarch. You get Tsar Peter the Great from Russia, and we're just highlighting a handful of examples just to give you an idea of some of the leaders of the era. He brought Western European values to Russia through Enlightenment ideals. And by the way, as Louis XIV built a palace, Peter the Great built a city. So there was a little bit of arrogance, competition going on in this era. And so Peter the Great looked at the Palace of Versailles and said, I can do more. Couldn't build a better palace, so he built an entire city, named it after himself. St. Petersburg in Russia, built by Tsar Peter the Great. And you get Austria. It's one of my favorites. Anna, you and Magenta will like this. Maria Theresa was the monarch in Austria. She became queen at 23 as she was pregnant with her fourth child. She gave birth to 16 children.
Oh my goodness.
Her husband, Francis of Habsburg-Lorraine, was not suited for politics, and so essentially he was, I don't know what he did. Maybe he changed diapers, who knows. But he didn't. He was not involved in at least not involved much in the political framework of the country. So while Maria Theresa was raising 16 children, she won the War of Austrian Succession. Think about it. She's a monarch who had 16 children and won a war.
Wow.
And revised legal policies and instituted public education.
She can multitask.
She can multitask. So she's pretty heroic when it comes to.
She must have been absolutely brilliant.
She had to be.
Yeah.
Had to be. 2 children is enough for me. I don't even want to think about 16. So there's Maria Theresa of Austria. Prussia, a country that no longer exists, but Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, was the monarch in Prussia. He participated in the War of Austrian Succession. He won territories in the 7 Years' War and built Prussia into a powerful kingdom.
Where was Prussia if it doesn't exist?
It was in the neighborhood of Germany and Austria and Russia. It was in that kind of wing.
Right.
But in terms of geographical nation state, it no longer exists. Their territories were kind of in certain ways, and I don't remember all the time frame of it. They lost some, they gained some here, they lost some in wars that would follow, and eventually they were just kind of assumed, their property was assumed or annexed by Germany, Austria, Russia, and likely several other countries.
So basically just kind of dissolved.
Mhm.
I like the name.
England. England had various leaders during this time. The Stuart dynasty followed Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the last Tudor monarch from the line of Henry VIII. In the middle of the Stuart reign, the English Revolution took place. And the English Revolution was directly related to the issue of the absolute monarchy, or the divine right of kings. In other words, the king having absolute authority to do whatever he chose to do. The situation was in 1640s, I believe. Charles I was king. He refused to call Parliament into session and eventually reigned during a period of civil war, which he lost. So, for example, the way that Parliament worked, and it may technically work this way now in Great Britain, it certainly has adapted.